You've been just swamped, I know, with delving into last season's statistics across the entire Big Ten. This is a big game coming up for Iowa. We're not used to right out of the gate going into a Big Ten opponent, with the exception of last year due to COVID with Purdue, and especially a team that's a top 20 nature. And then, of course, following that up with a Cyhawk game, which is in Ames, and of course against a top 10 team. So what are your key analytics? What have you found from Indiana last year that can help Iowa this year that you can tell us? I know some of this is confidential, that will just be shared between you and Kirk, but what can you tell us about Indiana?
Well, I can certainly give you some statistical comparisons between the two teams, and it is safe to say we need to be in midseason form in Game 1 and Game 2, as you mentioned. Now, the good news, and Chad Leisterkow pointed it out, and he's correct. If we're 0-2, does that prevent us from having a great season? The answer is no, because let's face it, if we lose to Indiana, that's not a loss within the Western Division.
Right.
You still got all 6 Western Division opponents out there. Obviously, if you go 6-0 versus the West, then you are in the championship game, unless, of course, you lost maybe 2 of those crossover games. If you lost 1, of course, at worst, you'd be tied with somebody else that you'd already beaten. So head-to-head, you would represent. So 1 loss in terms of 3 crossover games is acceptable, provided you sweep those teams in your side of the league. So in that regard, it's not a critical game, but who are we kidding? It's an important football game. It's a game that can give us some momentum into the Iowa State game. We need all the momentum we can get. The all-important turnover margin battle, you'll find this interesting. Iowa's very good in winning on turnovers. Last year in 8 ball games, we generated 18 turnovers on defense, and we turned the ball over 9 times. So we got exactly twice as many. We gained twice as many possessions of the football than we lost, 18 versus 9. Here's the bad news. Indiana forced 20 turnovers and only gave up 10 themselves. So they were also a 2-to-1 ratio. The ratios are exactly the same. They were plus 10 in 7 games, as I recall. Yeah, plus 10 in 7 games. So when I ranked all the teams in terms of turnovers, they were plus 1.43 per game. That's number 1 in the conference. Ohio State, incidentally, is number 2, and Iowa's number 3. So both teams do a good job of generating turnovers. You'd expect that would be a push on game day next week. Maybe we'll be even on turnovers. I don't doubt that that'll happen, because both teams understand how to protect the ball on offense, and they understand how to generate turnovers on defense. Moving on to some other categories, red zone scoring success. It's going to be strength versus strength. Let me explain why. We've consistently been one of the best teams in the Big Ten in terms of red zone defense. But last year in games played, Indiana was actually number 1 on red zone scoring defense. Iowa was number 2. I'm sorry, I take that back. Let me get my notes straight here. We were number 5 on red zone scoring defense. That's a little bit misleading. Here's what I was going to say about strength versus strength. We're number 1 on offense. Last year, we were the best team in the Big Ten on red zone scoring success. We averaged 4.87 points per opportunity, and you got to realize the max is 6, because I don't consider PATs as part of that number, part of that equation. So we made a good jump in terms of red zone efficiency on offense. The bad news is Indiana was number 1 on defense. So it's number 1 offense, our offense, versus number 1 ranked defense in the red zone in Indiana. And then when you look at the other side of the ball, Indiana's number 2 on offense. We're number 5 on defense, but I would say that's a little bit misleading. Let me explain why. There are a couple of one-sided wins we had where the other team was in the red zone 1 time and converted with 6 points. Well, our average for that particular game would be 6.0, of course, and that actually drug us down a little bit in terms of final rankings. So that I would say that ranking of number 5 is actually worse than what we really are, because the score really didn't matter that much. We gave up a touchdown, but we still won 35-7 or 28-7, whatever the case might be. So red zone efficiency is very even on both sides on the part of both teams. Both defenses do a great job of keeping the opposing offense out of the red zone. In other words, you don't even allow the other team to get there. Indiana's 2nd in the league. We're barely behind them, being 3rd in the league. So we're very, very even there. We do a good job of keeping the other team, both of us do, keep them out of the red zone. How about big plays? We're better than Indiana in preventing big plays. We were #1 in the conference in terms of preventing big plays. Hats off to Phil Parker. Believe it or not, in 8 ball games, there were only 4 snaps that produced 30 yards or more on the part of the other team. 4, which was the best in the conference, hands down. We were also best in terms of explosive versus super explosive. Explosive plays I define as 20 yards or more. Super explosive, 30 yards or more. We were #1 in both categories. Indiana was solid there too, though. Not nearly as good as us, but they're better than us at making big plays on offense. One place we very definitely can improve, we were ranked 13th amongst explosive and super explosive plays on offense. We need to do better than that. We can do better than that. Indiana was ranked considerably higher. They were #8 versus our 13. And then there's another category I want to talk about because I refer to them as positive and negative exceptions. And let me explain what that is. Let's use turnover margin as an example. If you win on turnovers, we've obviously already stated, win the game. If you do not win the game, if you win on turnovers and you lost the football game, you are what I would call a negative exception. In other words, you should have won the game based on the parameter, and yet you somehow found a way to lose for any number of other reasons. And today, Nebraska would be a good example of that. They actually won on total offense today. They had more yards than Illinois. Didn't matter. They still lost the game because they found ways to lose. They were, by definition, a negative exception today. So the team that's best in terms of being a positive exception and also best in terms of not being a negative exception, that team this year was Indiana. We were good, but not as good as them. In terms of positive exceptions, they were 1. We finished 4th. In terms of negative exceptions, they were #1. We finished 8th. And that's a significant stat. Let me give you one specific example of one reason they finished #1. You might remember the game, early season, Indiana versus Penn State. I know you remember the 2-point play at the end of the game.
Yep.
But here's the reality. Of those top 15 parameters that I identified as having the most to do with winning, believe it or not, Indiana won a total of 3 of those 15 parameters. Penn State won 12. How in God's name would Penn State win the game? Well, sometimes you got to find a way to win. And of course, in the end, that was defined by that successful 2-point play that was good by, I don't know, maybe a tenth of an inch.